throughout the first year, I just kept getting hit with how much coercion and force is just baked into the system. Like you're taking away their independence, their ability to make decisions, just kind of shuffling through the system and shuffling through the day. And like I was appalled at how much even within my own classroom, like there was so much I couldn't do to countervail the system, even if I tried. Even my best students, the kids that you just adore, you love having them in class, they're engaged, they're interested, they want to learn, they want to be there. They're like anxious about making choices and scared of leaving high school and just fundamentally feeling lack of confidence and unprepared. And it's just like, if our best students, if this is like the culmination of all of their education and they're not excited, they're not ready to go out into the world.
Hello, and welcome back to the Hannah Frankman podcast. On today's episode, I'm speaking with Samantha Westmoreland. Samantha is the writer in residence at Guidepost Montessori, and she's a former public school teacher who now is deeply, deeply knowledgeable about the Montessori pedagogy and approach. In today's episode, Samantha and I sat down to go deep into the Montessori approach to literacy. We talked about why the Montessori classroom is so effective at teaching reading to the point that their students are often reading at what would typically be considered a third grade level inside a conventional classroom in their kindergarten year. And we talk about some of the reading games and sound games that are introduced to kids at an early age that make reading so much fun for them. We also talk about the window in time roughly from when a child is aged 2 to 5, when they're particularly interested in language, and why the Montessori approach is so focused on harnessing that window in time when kids are optimally excited about language as the window of time to be teaching them how to read. We went super deep in this episode in different strategies and approaches and practical things that you can do at home with your kids who are learning how to read. And hopefully you find today's conversation both interesting and also practically useful. Samantha Westmoreland, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited about this. We're going to go super deep today into the Montessori approach to literacy, which is a rabbit hole I am so excited to go down with you. You wrote an amazing Twitter thread a couple weeks ago about how Montessori approaches literacy, which was not a surprise because you write a lot of amazing Twitter threads. And if anyone is listening to this and does not follow Samantha on Twitter, you are totally missing out, and you absolutely should. Her content is amazing. But this thread was particularly good because it was so specific. And it was such a contrast between how Montessori approaches literacy and how almost anyone else does. And literacy is already such a hot topic issue that I was super excited to invite you on the podcast because I thought we have to go deep on this. But let's talk a little bit about your background first, because you don't just work in Montessori education. You have a really interesting and kind of varied background that I want to draw on as we're talking about literacy, because you've seen this from a bunch of different angles. So you work with Guidepost Montessori right now. You're a professional writer. You're a very talented writer.
Thank you.
And so you're also deeply, deeply knowledgeable about the Montessori philosophy and approach. But before working in the Montessori world, you were a public school teacher. Can we talk about this first? How long did you work in public schools? What were you teaching? What was that experience like?
Yeah. So, my first career, I can say, was as a teacher, and I taught for 4 years in public schools. Honestly, because I had a grant that like helped pay for my university, and they said if you work this many years, you pay off. I would have quit after my first year teaching because I was so appalled at what I saw in the classroom. It just really hit me like a ton of bricks. But I decided to power through. I went to teach at an online school after I taught for the first year at a brick and mortar, and that was better in a lot of ways, but um, still had the same kind of fundamental issues that I experienced in the classroom. And so I eventually, decided to quit that. I went to school to become an engineer, um, mostly as like a backup plan because I was hoping to homeschool, and I was like, I hated math in school. I never planned to homeschool before um, teaching in a public school and realizing I do not want
Not
this in
this.
my kids. No, this is not happening. And so I was like, I'm very type A. So I was like, okay, if I'm going to be a homeschool parent, then I need to know things about math and science. That seems important. So I'll go back to school and I'll learn about math and science so that I can like do that thing that I've never planned on doing. And then along the way, I found Montessori and then fell in love, and here I am.
Where were you teaching in public schools? What region of the country?
I was in Michigan.
And what about it was so appalling to you in your first year? Because you also attended public schools, right? So you had some sense of what public school is going to be like.
That's true. I attended public school for high school, although before that I was in a private school. And I don't know, I was a little bit naive, I guess, because I always loved school when I was a kid, and I just thought, if you do it your work to make it fun, and if you connect with your students like on a personal level, then like kids can really like school. Like I love school. The things I didn't like about school were more the other kids, not the learning so much. um, but you know, throughout the first year, I just kept getting hit with how much like coercion and force is just baked into the system. Like you're taking away their independence, their ability to make decisions, just kind of shuffling through the system and shuffling through the day. And like I was appalled at how much even within my own classroom, like there was so much I couldn't do to countervail the system, even if I tried. And I mean, I think one thing that just really, I don't know, that stuck out to me that was really salient was that even my best students, the kids that you just adore, you love having them in class, they're engaged, they're interested, they want to learn, they want to be there. They're like anxious about making choices and scared of leaving high school and just fundamentally feeling lack of confidence and unprepared. And it's just like if our best students, if this is like the culmination of all of their education and they're not excited, they're not ready to go out into the world, like there's something deeply wrong with the system that culminates even in our best kids like that. And I don't know, it was very disturbing. And I didn't really have the words for what exactly was wrong until finding Montessori and just learning more about education in general. But yeah, that was I think the trajectory.
What attracted you to Montessori? Because you were doing a 180 career pivot. You were going from being a classroom teacher to studying to be an engineer, and then you ended up in Montessori schools again. What was the draw that made you feel like this was going to be an antidote to what you were seeing or the burnout that you were feeling coming out of the public school classroom?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because I found I think I found Montessori through moms, like, on YouTube. I was, very much fantasizing about this future point where maybe I'll be a stay-at-home mom and I'll be educating my own children, and I was really attracted to, I mean, just how much intentionality it seemed like one could have in the things that you did with your child. I spent a lot of time with babies as a kid, but it's like I don't know, you spend time with them and you have fun, and there's not a lot of thought necessarily that goes into it. And I was really attracted to this idea that there's these phases of development, and we can really think about how's the best way to support this particular stage. And they're interested in particular things if you observe. Um, I was really fascinated by that and just seeing how their children interacted in the world, how independent, how self-assured they were. It's just there nothing beats watching a toddler like set the table for themselves, prepare their own snack. And it's like there's a little man who's just, you know, operating in life, and he's just so happy to do it. It's like you can see the joy on his face. It's like this is possible. So that was one thing that attracted me to Montessori. But the next was that I just at a book fair found a Montessori book. It was Dr. Montessori's own handbook. It's probably one of the most approachable Montessori books. So if you're interested in Montessori, it's a book I would recommend. And it's really just her going through essentially the curriculum for preschool and kindergarten, and the level of detail and organization and just seeing how clearly things are presented to children. Like there's instead of so part of the background is that I went to teachers college. I got an education on how to educate, except my education on how to educate was how to manage a classroom, how to get kids to do what you want them to do in a big group because we need to get everybody to do the same thing at the same time. Like that is like 90% of my college degree in education. It wasn't like thinking about like, how do you make concepts real to children? Like, how do you really help them understand them? How do you go from one step to the next? And so that there was this much thought in pedagogy was just, it was really, it really resonated with me. And I just dove in from there.
How do you feel like the level of intention that Montessori had for every stage of a child's development compared to the education and pedagogy that you got studying for 4 years in college to be a teacher?
Right. Like it's essentially uncomparable. Like there's just like in my degree, for example, learning to teach, like you learn the content, let's say. You'll take math classes, I taught Spanish, I also taught lots of subjects for English language learners. So you'll learn the content and then you'll learn classroom management. There's not really like how do you like what does it mean to know something? How do you get from point A to point B? How do you like help the child really grasp this idea? I think that's not just it's just not really a part of the curriculum, at least that I experienced in teachers college and of all the teachers I've ever talked to that they experienced either. Um, Whereas in Montessori, so much of the focus is on, how do we make things come to life and how do we give children work that they can do to apply these concepts so that it really becomes real to them, that it becomes embedded and built into how they look at the world. It's not just something they've heard once and maybe they remembered it for a test and they repeated it. But it's something that they've built into themselves.
Okay, so let's springboard from here into the literacy thing because there's a lot to unpack here, but it's related to what you just said. So one of the things that you talked about in the Twitter thread that you wrote was the extent to which Montessori makes literacy a set of very enticing actions for a child to take, but also a series of actions that are accessible to them at a very early age, which leads to literacy rates that are significantly higher, but also significantly more advanced than where children are, considered to be on track with a more conventional literacy approach. So actually want to talk about the literacy rates of Montessori for a minute because some of the stats are really impressive. Montessori students are typically, correct me if I'm wrong with this, but in kindergarten, reading at a third grade level. They're 3 grades advanced. Is that correct?
I mean, it depends on the individual child, right? But the curriculum, like it's normal. Like it's not outside of the realm of possibility, and it's not like only the top students are at that level. Um, if they're progressing normally in the curriculum, they'll be reading sentences like, um, I was just looking at one the other day. He folded his arms and sat down next to the other students. Like that is an advanced kind of sentence. And they're doing it in interesting ways. It's not like the whole book, for example, might be at that level, but they're able to parse that, to understand it, to work with it, and it's exciting to them because it is on the edge of their ability.
And in a normal Montessori progression, they'd be hitting that level of literacy at what age range?
So it'd be in their 3rd year of Children's House, so they're normally around 5, 5.5, maybe towards the end of the kindergarten year, 6 years old, depending on when they started.
So, how does Montessori do such an effective job of progressing kids to that level of literacy so quickly when inside the average classroom we have, I mean, the reading stats are abysmal. Like, you know, 50% of high school students still can't read at a 6th grade level. Like, what are what is Montessori doing so effectively that allows children to not just be an outlier and read that quickly? Because normally you would think a child that has that level of literacy is just a really exceptional student, but in fact that the average student is able to do that.
Right. I mean, the biggest thing is that we're tapping into a sensitive period that children, really young children have, which is their interest in language. And we're doing it in a way that's really tactile, that's really concrete, that they can access at their level, and giving them a lot of different opportunities, a lot of varied opportunities to practice that, because reading just is one of those skills that you have to repeat. You have to practice. There has to be a lot of repetition to make it automatic. Like no matter when you're learning, that is part of the process. And yet we're doing it in a way that's really approachable, kind of at the outer edge of what's possible for them at each stage. And that's what makes them really excited, because it's like I can almost do it. It's a challenge, and it makes them want to do the repetition rather than have to be forced to do the repetition, which is often what happens when you wait till later.
So when is this window in which students are, or children are particularly interested in literacy, like this, or sorry, language, this really sweet spot for starting to introduce them to literacy?
Yeah, I mean, it really starts at birth, right? That children are interested in language, and there's definitely things that you can do in the Montessori approach to like tap into that interest in language, but where we're thinking like formal literacy, where we're really going to start pouring some real intentionality into starting to teach children to read. We're thinking around 2.5, 3 years old is usually when we're starting that formal curriculum, even though there are things we're doing with babies and toddlers.
There's a fairly large camp of people who feel very strongly that it's not good to introduce formal instruction of any kind too early, and especially of literacy, that kids need a chance to just be kids, and that teaching them to read can wait, and that, once they start entering their kindergarten year, that's the appropriate time to start giving them formal instruction. What would be your response to that stance, or maybe even your like what you would say to assuage some of the fears that introducing literacy too early is sort of trampling on the natural progressions of childhood?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I understand the fear, because it's coming from a place where, like, the average person's mental model of what it means to teach somebody to read. It means you have to sit down for these really boring, repetitive, abstract lessons where we're gonna, it's like a handwriting thing. We're gonna like write the letter A 300 times on one piece of paper. Like, I'm bored thinking about doing that. Your 2-year-old is gonna have a revolt to try and do that. But I would just encourage people to think that that's not the only way to teach children to read, and that if you really approach, instruction of any kind, to teach anything from the perspective of, what are children interested in at particular stages? What are they capable of at particular stages? And really adapt everything that you do to teach them that skill to what you know about what they're interested in and capable of, then it doesn't have to be that way. And they can experience reading to be completely joyful the entire time. And, you know, that if you do that as well, like it is the ideal time. 2.5, 3, 4 years old is the ideal time developmentally to learn to read if you do it in a way that's aligned with their development.
This is one of the things that I've always found most striking about Montessori is what a great job the philosophy does of mapping its instructional materials to children's interests at different points in their development and really respecting and in some ways deferring to the natural developmental stages of the child. It feels very structured when you look at it from the outside, but a lot of the underlying philosophy is based in what a child at certain developmental stages is most likely to be gravitating towards and most likely to be deeply and ravenously curious about. And I think that's a really great way to approach thinking about what you're introducing at different stages, even if you're not taking a strictly Montessori approach. I think that's a really helpful thing to draw out of this philosophy. And I also think, if you want to better understand what children are interested at different phases, you should read Montessori because she did such an amazing job studying this and deeply researching it. But it's also something that is really helpful to just shift your awareness towards when you're spending time around kids, just noticing what they're curious about and what they seem to be interested in. And then, starting to adhere what you're doing to that accordingly, more and more shifting towards that.
Right.
But one of the things that you've alluded to a couple of times is that what you're doing with kids is not sitting down with a worksheet and going, okay, in this row, you're going to copy the letter A as many times as you can. And then in this row, you're going to copy the letter B as many times as you can. And kids get a little tiny dopamine hit from filling out the worksheet. But besides that, it's incredibly boring and feels entirely fruitless. That is not what you're talking about when you
No.
say we're introducing kids to language. What are the actual things when a child is 2.5, they are interested in language, they're at a point in their cognitive development where they can begin to understand the more abstract elements of language to some extent,
Mhm.
and they have the fine motor skills to be able to do things like hold a pencil. What are the things that you're beginning to introduce them to that are preparing them for literacy, but are not as obvious nor as boring as a worksheet?
Right. I mean, if we think about, your normal 2.5, 3-year-old child, they've just hit the stage where they can talk. They can say sentences, they can understand you pretty well, and this is a whole new world for them. They love learning new words, they love language, they love, listening, repeating. They seem to learn a word a mile a minute. And so when we're thinking about literacy with a child at that stage, what we're thinking about is auditory language. How can I make this fascination they already have? How can I expand it? How can I make it deeper? And so we're going to play games that draw the child's awareness, their attention to the fact that words are made up of individual sounds. And you, the child, you yourself, you can hear the different sounds that are in each word. You can isolate them. You can play with the way that they sound. You can, stretch out, you know, ah, t. We can do these kinds of games with sounds and with words, and it is extremely engaging and enticing to them to play. And so the very first activity we do, it's called sound games in the formal literacy curriculum. And you'll take the child and you'll have a few different objects in front of you with objects they know the words for, that they know the vocabulary already. And you can just start to play a game where you're like, can you find me the one that starts with p? And they'll look at the objects, they know the word, and it's just like a game of I spy almost. where Simon Says, because you can say, you can ask them to do things with the different objects based on the sound. You're just progressively leveling up the difficulty there and playing games that they're already interested in.
Can you share some other examples of games that are played with children at these early stages? Because that does sound like a fun game. And it sounds like the kind of game that a child would want to play again, would ask you to play because it feels just challenging and fun to them. It's like a puzzle. And so
Right.
it doesn't feel like school or work. What are some other ones that, especially in these earlier stages of the literacy development, that kids are also being exposed to or taught how to play?
Right. So, I mean, other games are just like straightforward vocabulary games where we're doing something really similar, but instead of, focusing on the sounds, we're focusing on the words. And so you might have, figurines of animals or instruments, and they're like really realistic and miniature. And I don't know, something about realistic miniature things are always really attractive to toddlers. You think about, I have all these knickknacks on my shelf and they're there for decor, and it's like beeline straight towards it. Let me touch it.
So
Um, so
true.
it's pretty similar to the sound games where you're going to ask the child to find the particular object after you introduce the name, and or do things with it. Can you put the zebra next to the tiger? Can you put the zebra on top of the tiger? And like you can build it up with your own personality. Um, you can make it really unique to you, but the idea of the game is really similar. And the child, like, they're getting that one-on-one connection with you, and they're getting to learn new words, and your enthusiasm is going to do a lot for the game as well.
Yeah, that definitely makes a difference when you're playing with, I mean, honestly, kids of any age, but especially small children. If you're excited about it, they're going to mirror your energy,
Yeah.
which could make a big difference.
This is not, all right, I have the objects. Now sit down, sit down. Here's a zebra. Say it, zebra. Like, this is not this is not the energy that we're bringing. This is not what we're doing. It's all very engaging.
So then, after the kids start being exposed to these games, they start to understand that words are things that can be broken down into differing sounds. They can start to
Right.
dissect those sounds a little bit themselves. What comes next?
Yeah, so once we're noticing that they're getting really familiar with that, they might even just do it automatically, just in the wild. When you're talking, they'll just point out, "Ah, that word starts with this sound or ends with this other sound." They start to get really familiar with it. Um, the next step is the sandpaper letters, which, if you know anything about Montessori, you might be familiar with that material because it's one of the iconic Montessori materials. But it's we start to introduce the alphabet, a few letters at a time, and they're going to do it in a very tactile way. So they're these little wooden boards. They have the letters etched in sandpaper, and the child gets to. We make a whole song and dance about. We're going to prepare our fingers so that we can really touch and tell what the shape of this is. So we'll like rub our fingers on some paper towel or maybe a cloth to get it really sensitive. And now we're going to trace. I'll let them trace the letter. We'll show them exactly how to trace, which is going to be in the same kind of motion you would use once you're learning to write way later down the road. And then we'll give them the sound that they already know because they've practiced it hundreds of times with the games. And we'll introduce just a few at a time, and we'll keep going with more. If they're really into the lesson, then we can bring more letters, but over the course of weeks, months, as at their own pace, kind of the letters and doing the same kind of thing.
And at what point do you introduce the names of the letters and connect them to the phonetic sounds that they've been learning? Does that happen right away when they start tracing the letters, or does that get delayed?
But by the name, do you mean like A, B, C, D, like
Yes.
that? Yeah, so that is an interesting point in Montessori, is that is not how we introduce the letters. The kids might already know it, to be honest, because it's in the air, in the culture, probably all the things that are on TV that they're watching, but we're not intentionally introducing that. I mean, if they point it out, we might talk to them about it if they know already, but we're introducing it based on the sounds that they know. So we don't say A, we might say ah, not B, but B, things like that.
Is there a point in time where they do start to learn the names of the letters as a prerequisite for reading, or does that come after they already can read words in books?
I think it's gonna depend on each individual child. I'm actually not familiar if there's a particular lesson where we, like, intentionally teach the name of the letters of the alphabet, so I actually don't know. It's not a part of, like, the Montessori progression of teaching. If it comes up, I think it comes up, but yeah, I'm not sure exactly if there's a certain point where we might.
That's actually really interesting that it's not something that's a point of emphasis because for most people, I think that's the default of where to begin. Even if you're teaching your kids phonics, you're going to
Right.
teach them the letter names because it feels like an important part of the code. Like
Yeah.
to learn how to spell mom, you need to know it's MOM. And so you need to know the name of the letter because that's part of the power of understanding how to deconstruct it and then reconstruct it into something else. So it's really interesting that Montessori doesn't think that's important at all.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily. It's just another layer of abstraction for a really young child, because the names don't necessarily correspond completely with the sounds, and so we're focusing really concretely on what the child can experience for themselves. Like they don't like without any intermediaries. They know the sound mm. They don't know M. What's M? Is that the same as mm? And that's also the same as the symbol M? Like it adds a layer of confusion, at least it can. And so yeah, it's not an emphasis.
So then after they've started playing with the sandpaper letters and they're learning the shapes and they're learning the phonetic sounds that correspond with that, where does that start to translate into longer words? Does that also begin with games where they're sounding out the different parts of a word or breaking down the different parts of a word before they ever see it on paper? Or is it happening in correspondence with the very tactile experience of the sandpaper letters, or is there something else?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of a really interesting feature of Montessori that the next step isn't to jump to reading words or to sounding out words. It's actually to start writing, although not writing with a pencil, but to form your own words. And so, usually concurrently at the same time that we're introducing the alphabet. So, before they've learned all 26 letters, or if it's a different language, there might be more letters. But before they've even finished learning all of the letters, once they're familiar with a set, we'll give them a new material. It's the movable alphabet. And these are just like, parents, you probably have these at home, like magnetic alphabet materials. These are just wooden versions of that. And, you can string them together to form words. And, the child can think of his own words that he's already practiced sounding out. And as long as he, knows the first couple sets of the symbols, then he can start to write, his own words that he can't actually really read yet, but he can sound out each letter individually and string it together to write, to communicate a message that's his own.
So effectively, kids are learning phonetic spelling before they're learning how to read anything.
Right, and I like that you put it as phonetic spelling because it's not gonna be proper spelling at this stage, and that's totally okay, that's not the goal. The goal is to get them practicing connecting the sounds to the symbols, like, that is the whole goal at this stage, and other goals come later. But yeah, they're writing before they're reading.
And at what age roughly is that being introduced? And is there a lot of variance in that depending on how quickly they progress through other things, or is it pretty standard?
No, there's a lot of variance for each individual child. I'd say in general, like it's going to be maybe couple months after they've like done the sound games and they've started doing the sandpaper letters, they'll
Hmm.
be introduced to the movable alphabet. So they could be 3.5, 3, 4. It really depends. But it's kind of the next step in that progression.
And then do they leap from that to the actual phonetic sounding out of words?
Eventually, yeah. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other activities that they'll do because they usually get quite into writing. And so there's all different kinds of alphabets that they can use, and eventually start to write with pencils or trace them in sand. There's a lot of work with writing, but yeah, eventually they do start to work on reading, and we'll normally go back to some of the same objects that they used to learn vocabulary and to learn sounds, except now we add a new material with it. We add like a piece of paper that has the word written on it. Or we might play a game where I'm going to write you a secret and I'm going to write the first letter on a piece of paper. Here, you can look at it and you can pick out the object that matches with it. I'm going to do the next one. So like it's a very similar process in the game, but we're just adding that new level of skill. So it's always very intellectually at the edge of what they're able to do, and so it's always engaging, even though it's like the same basic game, which makes it really great if you're a teacher and if you're learning the curriculum and presenting it for materials. Like there's a lot of efficiency that's saved there, but for the kid, it's still fully engaging because what's new is that intellectual achievement that they're striving for.
How does this compare? And I know compare is a very strong word because it almost feels like it's an entirely different category of thing. But you were trained as a teacher. And part of that training was learning about the standard American public school literacy curriculum. How does this compare to the way that you were taught to teach reading in a conventional classroom?
Yeah, so I'll qualify it that, I was taught how to teach kids to read in a very particular context for students who are learning English as a second language. So often for immigrants or families that speak different languages at home. And so it might be different how they teach teachers in other like elementary training programs, but I was essentially taught, you know, you have to give kids strategies for how to learn to read. Look at the picture, look at the table of contents, look at the headings in each chapter, um, look at the cover of the book. All of these strategies to kind of like grasp what is it that we're doing in this book or in this piece of text. Strategies that ultimately end up guessing the word, not a lot of phonics, which I remember being like, "Huh, I wonder why we're not teaching them, like, how to sound out words." That's how I learned how to read, but, I was thinking, "Oh, I guess maybe things are different when it's not your first language." I don't know. So, but that is kind of the approach that I was given in teachers college.
But you were taught using phonics?
As a kid, I was.
Do you remember learning how to read?
See, it's so I remember being taught to read in school, like, the lessons, but I already knew how to read before school, so I just thought it was really fun because, like, I already know how to do all of this, and I was very charged up by knowing how to do things. This feels great, gold star to me. But but I don't remember I actually, like, don't remember what it felt like not knowing how to read. Like, I can't conjure a memory of, like, looking at a page and not knowing what was there because I learned before school just from my grandma reading with me. And I wish she was still around so that I could ask her, like, "What did you do? Like, did you just read with me? Like, was there something intentional that you did?" Because I have no idea. I just know that she read books with me and I knew how to read.
If you knew how to read without going into the classroom and getting formal classroom instruction, um, you have some perspective on the pushback that people sometimes offer to traditional reading instruction, which is especially people in the unschooling world, which is if you just expose your kids to literacy and spend a lot of time around them reading to them, they'll pick it up and they don't need a formal reading curriculum. What would be your response to that? Because that's very at odds with what you're describing, which is a very nuanced and very lengthy curriculum to prepare children for literacy.
Yeah, I mean, there definitely are children that they they do just kind of pick up on it just by you reading with them or, working with them, looking at books. I don't think that that is true for the vast majority of children, that that's possible. And I do also think that every child, even the child who would just pick it up on their own eventually just from exposure, that every child benefits from the practice, the logical introduction, and they would enjoy it even if they would pick up on it. So I just think that the logical introduction to reading in a way that's, you know, designed for development, that's engaging, like there really aren't downsides to that, even if, yes, suppose perhaps this might be a kind of child, a particular child who could do it on their own. There really isn't a downside besides time.
How would you describe the difference for people who are very solidly in the camp of kids don't need instruction, they'll pick it up on their own? How would you describe the difference between speaking instruction and reading instruction? Because kids are hyper interested in language early in their toddler years, and they are picking up an entire verbal spoken language,
Mhm.
which may make it feel like a child could also pick up a written language. What, in your mind, makes the distinction between these two categories of thing that make the reading instruction need so much more focused
Mm,
support than what you might offer in the Montessori classroom for verbal communication?
I see. So you're asking, like, what makes learning a language natural, just, like, happens for every child who's living in a home who has people speaking versus learning to read. Is that the question?
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there are a number of things that are that distinguish those 2, and, I mean, the most important is that reading is an abstraction. Like, it's abstract that there are these symbols that represent sounds, and the sounds, when strung together in particular patterns, represent words. Now that's not just a thing that's occurring naturally that just forces itself upon a child's consciousness and upon human consciousness. Like, not all humans have had written languages. It's an achievement to have a written language. It's something that saves a lot of time for humanity in trying to communicate. It's an advancement, and it's an advancement in thought for children just as much as it is for human civilization. And so it some children can pick up because they're good at matching patterns, and, if somebody's being there intentional with them. But the patterns, they're there. But for a lot of children, they don't just see the patterns, um, you know, as they go. It takes a lot more of a intentional introduction to really point out, like, here's what's happening. I mean, if you think about, I mean, it's more like riding a bike than learning to walk. Everybody learns to walk if they're healthy. Not everybody learns how to ride a bike unless you practice riding a bike. And it often takes a lot of effort. A lot of younger kids nowadays who don't spend as much time outside, even though they have bikes, don't know how to ride a bike because it really does take a lot of repetition and kind of support from other people to learn.
What is it about the way that Montessori approaches literacy that lead to so many Montessori kids liking reading? Because one of the points that you made in the thread that you wrote, and one of the things that I've encountered consistently both in my reading about Montessori, but also engaging with Montessori schools and Montessori students, is that in general, Montessori kids seem to not only know how to read, but they seem to like it. They seem to, at
Right.
least relatively, spending all afternoon with your nose in the book is not every child's favorite activity or idea of a good time. And that's just consistent across the board with people's personalities. That has nothing to do
Right.
with the education you receive necessarily. But there doesn't seem to be a resentment of reading. If I walk into a Montessori classroom and kids are in the middle of a work cycle, which is, their uninterrupted work, focused work time for those who are unfamiliar with Montessori schools, it's very common to see kids, at least a couple of them, sitting there with a book and they're reading, and that's what they've chosen to spend their time doing when, they could be doing anything they wanted with their time. So they clearly don't hate it. And many
Right.
of them really like it. What is it that the education approach is getting right that makes it fun for kids?
Right. I mean, I think a lot of it is tapping into their developmental interests in language in a way that's really engaging. But also, the curriculum is structured and I've been kind of emphasizing kind of the logic and intentionality to it. And it can feel, if that's the only thing I'm emphasizing, like it's restrictive or very rigid. But, we have a progression. We have materials that are intentional, but the child's entry point is up to them. Like when they're interested in it, that's when we start and not sooner. And their particular progression, how much focus they spend on one material versus another, how much time they need to really master one area or one skill versus another. All of that is completely individualized. They're not being shuffled through a curriculum in lockstep with 30 other kids being told, this is how much time we have allotted to master this skill. Oh, you need more time? Too bad. Or, oh, you want to be racing ahead and you're bored out of your mind? Too bad. Like that's not happening in the curriculum. They really like have the experience at every single stage of this is the best thing ever. I'm learning so much. I'm at the edge of what I'm capable of and I can see myself achieving more. And oh, I reached the end and I can just keep going. I don't like there's none of these artificial kind of barriers that turn learning anything, even things that you love, into a chore.
You mentioned that some of the preparation for this can begin even before a child reaches that 2.5 to 3 year old window. What are some of the things that Montessori guides are doing even when a child is very, very small, that's prepping them for being ready to start engaging with some of these games and some of these materials once they hit that like mid-toddler age range?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, the foundation for, you know, practicing the sounds, for example, at the very beginning of their phonics instruction is, you know, being really familiar with words, the way that words sound naturally in language. And so much of the focus with babies and toddlers is just going to be speaking with them, reading books, singing songs, but also we do what's called sports casting, where we just start talking in natural language with proper words, proper pronunciation about things that are happening, that the child is experiencing, that they're feeling, that we're doing. We'll narrate diaper changes, we'll narrate um, feedings, we'll narrate all the things that we do, and so they love that because they're interested in language and they want to know what are they're making all this noise. What is all that about? Like it's interesting to them, and and so I mean that's the foundation. If you're going to do it in a really warm, engaging way. Um, and you're just doing that all the time throughout all the things that they're doing. You can start playing in toddler. We start playing more games that are really focused on just building vocabulary. So some of them I mentioned were like, you have a figurine, and we're going to learn that this is a zebra, and we're building up vocabulary in that way as well because that's a big part of reading comprehension.
What is the approach that's taken if there's a child who is resistant to some of this or doesn't seem terribly excited about it? Is either signaling that they're not ready or they're just kind of disinterested? And I'm thinking partly through the lens of someone who's listening to this who doesn't have their child in a Montessori school, but they're, listening to some of the things that they're saying and they're excited to implement them at home. But, maybe the child isn't terribly familiar with Montessori work sessions. And so they'll be easily distracted, or maybe they just inherently aren't that interested in the game. What is the general approach that's taken inside of a Montessori classroom if a kid doesn't seem ready yet?
Right. So the fundamental is observing the child, trying to understand kind of where they're at, what they are interested in. So and what skills that are at the foundation. So, we don't start in a Montessori preschool with the reading curriculum. It's not the first thing that we introduce. For example, we're going to spend a lot of time doing what's called practical life, things like preparing snack and washing tables and dusting and zipping up coats and tying shoes, all these like really engaging like home like tasks that kids really like. And, through observing children do these, we get a familiarity of what they're really interested in, whether it's like doing things with water or they really like the fine motor exercises, tying shoes, for example. Like we get a sense of what they're interested in, what about a Montessori activity in the language curriculum we could call their attention to get them interested into the activity and find our way in, um, to do the materials. But if they're not ready at a particular time, that's okay. Like we're gonna watch and we're gonna understand kind of where they're at, and we'll introduce it again at a later time. We'll let some time pass and like, yeah, they're focusing on something else right now, and that's totally okay. There's not this pressure of, all right, it's Monday on September 3rd. This is the time that we said we have to start the reading curriculum. Like it's very child paced in that way. It's not the end of the story if the child says they're not interested or they're like, we're going to try again. But um, there's so much flexibility in when and how and the way in that we try to reach the child.
You also talked about this sort of magic window when a child is very, very interested in language as being the sweet spot for introducing a lot of this because they're already interested. And so they're just going to be quicker to engage and really drop into the lesson and take a lot from it. If someone is approaching this later in a child's developmental progression, they have a kid who is entering their kindergarten year and they're ready to introduce reading. And so they're looking for different options for how to teach their child reading, and they stumble upon the Montessori approach. They might think that it's too late because they've already missed this sweet spot window. What happens if that window isn't hit and a child's being taught reading a little bit later? And what are the best practices at that point in time?
Yeah, that's such a great question. It's not too late in the sense that obviously you can learn to read later, and in a certain respect, it's easier to learn later. I mean, the thing that makes it challenging, and it's just something you have to recognize, is that they're not going to want to do as much repetition with the materials, with any approach that you use to read later on, whether they're 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, whether you're using Montessori, like the magic is not the Montessori materials, or it's not wholly in the Montessori materials. It's in their development too. So the challenge that has to be addressed is that they're not going to want to do as much practice. And so it's going to be harder to become automatic because they're just not getting as many repetitions. And so you'd really have to rely on like what you know about the child to make it engaging, and it's just going to take a lot more from you as the teacher or as the parent or as the adult to make it engaging, to find new ways for them to access it and to get practice. And it might look different than how it would look with the Montessori materials at 2.5, 3 years old, and that's okay. You want it to be engaging and fun, whatever stage that they're at. So what I hope is that people don't feel trapped that I have to use these materials even if they're older, and now I have to sit there and kind of force them to do it. Like, I think you should modify and you should find ways in, and it's probably gonna have to look different at an older age. I mean, at 5 years old, they might still be within that window because every child is different, but if we're talking like 6, 7, I think you wanna look at different ways in.
So if someone's listening to this conversation and they have a child who is somewhere in this window of being ready to start engaging with literacy, and the child is not enrolled in a Montessori school, the parent's taking the lead in driving this progression, what would be your top pieces of advice for replicating some of this at home? Because some of what you're talking about requires more specialized materials, which a parent, may be able to acquire, but also maybe doesn't want to spend resources on. Like the level of some of the games that you're talking about are totally doable at home, but the level of some of
Right.
this is sort of contingent on how many resources a parent wants to throw into learning how to do the Montessori approach and buy the materials and stuff. But what would be your biggest recommendations for taking a Montessori inspired approach to literacy in the home as a parent?
Right. I mean, like you mentioned, there's so many of the games that you can just do at home. It really not very many materials required at all. Like, you can play the sound games where you're practicing hearing the sounds that words start with just using objects around your house. You don't need any special figurines. You can pick out some of their toys. You can pick out objects from the kitchen, objects from your office, and you can introduce them, make sure the child knows their name, and you can play the exact same games. Can you find the one that starts with S? And they grab the stapler, right? Like, you can do the same kind of practice with phonics, and you can make it more challenging as you go, like not just the beginning letter, but the ending sound of the word. So you can level it up that way. Um, and then, I mean, you don't need the Montessori materials specifically either to do the further steps. Like, if you want to introduce the letters of the alphabet, you can DIY your own kind of version. Like, you could get note cards and glue glitter in the shape of the letters and make your own sandpaper letters. And it has that same tactile effect where they can trace it with their hand and you can tell them the sound. Like, there's so much creativity if you want to do it from home, because the approach in essence is really simple, um, and you don't need the full materials to do them.
And do you have any recommendations if a parent is really excited to introduce some of this to their child, but their child doesn't have a lot of exposure to the focused Montessori work time and so is maybe easily distracted or just isn't super excited? So the parent tries to introduce the child and the child is not focused and is trying to hijack the game and turn it into something else, or gets distracted really easily and wants to go run outside and see the squirrel that's climbing up the tree or do something else. Do you have recommendations for either helping to develop that focus on time or bringing them back into the lesson, or maybe what the appropriate amount of time is if they're really disengaged to wait before you reintroduce it? Do you have any advice for parents in that regard?
Right, like, I wouldn't stress out about, "All right, I've set up this time to do the language lesson, and now they're doing something else." Like, what like, you can observe your child. What are the things that seem to draw them in, catch their attention, and, you know, don't interrupt them when that's happening, and find more opportunities to do activities like the one that you see they get engaged in. It's often, if we're talking toddlers, it's gonna be something with food or something with water. Those are often the things that are really gonna draw them in and want to make them focus. And you can spend a long time, weeks, months, just doing activities like that. Just setting aside part of your morning, a couple hours where there's no time pressure, for them to just engage and really get into a state of flow. And then, reintroduce language games or language activities, a little bit later once you see them, developing focus like that.
If you could change one thing about how literacy is approached in the average conventional classroom, what would you change?
Ooh, that is such a good question. I Here, because here's something that we didn't really get to talk about much. I would change this idea that English is not a phonetic language, and that spelling and learning how to read is just they're just these sight words that you memorize what they look like, and that's how you learn to read them. Um, Most words in English are phonetic if you know the rules. Um, there's lots of rules. English is a bear. I'm not going to lie that English is not a challenge, but you can learn the rules. A child can learn them. They can learn the patterns, the IGH or SH. They can learn that there are these rules, and they can sound out words. So I think that would be the number one thing I would change. Get rid of sight words. Sight words don't need to exist. If you introduce the spelling patterns, just like we're introducing all of these other aspects of learning to read in an engaging way with games and with tactile, hands-on experiences, they can learn even those in a way that's fun.
We've covered a lot of ground here, and I suspect and I hope this will be very helpful for parents who have smaller children in the, pre-literacy or early literacy stage of development. But a lot of the underpinnings of Montessori that we're talking about are broadly applicable to kids of any age. I've had some of your colleagues on the podcast. I've had Matt Bateman on the show twice. I've had Laura Mazer on. I've had Ray Gurn. So those are good jumping off points for people if they want to know more about Montessori. But what would be your top recommendations? Where would you send them both to learn more about Montessori, but also to read more of your work about Montessori, because you are also a scholar of the Montessori approach and you're quite knowledgeable about it. And you've written extensively about this too.
Yes, if I would accept all followers if you want to follow me on Twitter.
You really
I
should, guys. She's really good.
Samantha Joy on Twitter. I also write for our Substack Higher Ground Friday Notes, and I mean I really would. I have the books here. So my top favorite books: Dr. Marie Montessori's own handbook. Um, it's super approachable, and it just goes through the preschool curriculum and kind of the thought behind each area of the curriculum and what each material is designed to do and why it's set up the way that it is. Another really good resource is this Montessori from the Start, and really anything by this author, Lillard. She has done lots of research into Montessori, and there's a lot of great resources here, especially for parents at home, starting from birth, things that you can do and kind of, what development is like at each stage from birth to 3 years old.
Amazing. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, Samantha. This has been really, really fun. And I really appreciate you getting into the weeds with me about practical things that parents can do. Hopefully, there are parents who will be playing some of these word games with their kids this week. I absolutely will be the next time I get to hang out with small children. So thank you so much for taking the time. Thank you for sharing. This has been so much fun.
Yeah, so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. We will talk more soon. All right, my friends, that is a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. I hope that you found this valuable. Please leave a 5-star rating on Apple or Spotify. Please like the video on YouTube. And please don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you listen to make sure that you don't miss next week's episode. Thank you so much, friends. I will see you next week.